From the first time he raised someone from the dead, it took him 3 times to push them against the wall, but they came back to life again. He was also known for being very abrupt in the prayer lines. He would hit cancers and punch people in the stomach and sometimes be very rude in what he told them to do. This is none other than Smith Wigglesworth. He was known for saying, "I'm 1,000 times bigger on the inside than I'm on the outside." I'm Robert Slayton with God's Generals. The British Isles has produced a lot of greatness in the world. They have helped form nations. They've helped solve wars. But one thing it's also known for is how it has blessed the world with the faith of Christianity. John Wesley came from there. You've got George Jeffreys out of the Elam movement. And probably one of the most unusual personalities, especially for the Pentecostal world, is a man named Smith Wigglesworth. When I first began studying the life of great preachers and revival leaders, I read Smith Wigglesworth's biography called The Apostle of Faith. When I first read it, I thought, can these stories really be true about how he preached and prayed for the sick? And so I began my journey to see if these stories were true, and they were true. Smith Wigglesworth was known for his unusual ability to create faith in people's heart when he preached, but probably the stories that now live long after his death is how he was so abrupt, how he was so uncouth in the way he would pray for those seeking healing from his prayers. And so we'll start with the study of where Wigglesworth began his life. First, like I said, he comes from Great Britain. And so can you believe today, with England being so calm and so proper, here comes an unusual personality that does not even act British. You wouldn't even consider him British in the way he would pray for the people and how abrupt he was in answering some of their most logical and simple questions. One time he was praying for a man that needed healing that night. He came back the next night and he told him, "Didn't I pray for you last night?" And the man said, "Yes, but I wasn't healed." And Wigglesworth says, "Well, that's unbelief. Get out of my prayer line." And pushed him out of the prayer line and didn't even pray for him. Wigglesworth believed you pray once, that's faith. You pray twice, that's unbelief. So that'll begin to give you a little bit of his personality, a little bit of his flavor of how he was. He was born again when he was a little boy. He was raised in Bradford. He went to his grandmother's Methodist church where he first found Jesus. And then when the bishop confirmed him into the Church of England, then he realized, became aware, I should say, of the presence of God. And that was probably the first time that he records in his writings that he felt and became aware of God's tangible presence, which would be something that he would live in and desire for the rest of his life once he got into his ministry. Now, to understand Wigglesworth's life a little bit better, we're in the 1800s, the middle to the last utter part of the 1800s, and there was a revival group of people called the Salvation Army. Now, most of the Salvation Army today in England and America and around the world, they don't act like they did when William Booth and his wife Catherine were alive and had just founded the Salvation Army. If you were alive in the 1800s, or the middle 1800s, I should say, you should join the Salvation Army because that was where God was moving the most dramatic and the most powerful ways at that time. These people prayed for souls and went for the worst first and got them. And so this is where Wigglesworth began his ministry. Wigglesworth did not begin praying for the sick. He began working in the Salvation Army in winning souls and helping what we would call today the children's ministry. The children's ministry for him was this, that he would get a little pony and walk down the streets of Bradford, and you know how little horses or ponies would attract kids, and all the kids would run up and want to pet the horse and want to ride the horse. And so Wigglesworth would say, "I'll give you a ride to the church, the Salvation Army church, there and back if you'll go to church with me." And all the kids would say, "Yes, we'll go, we'll go." And that's how Wigglesworth began his ministry for Jesus. And so in one of the Salvation Army meetings, there was a lady preacher. Now, back in those days, women preachers were very unusual. So for the Salvation Army to empower women and let women preach was a big deal, especially in the 1800s. And so Gypsy Smith's sister was preaching, and Smith Wigglesworth was in the balcony, and she gave an altar call, and he noticed a lady walking down the aisle and gave her life to Jesus that day. And while he was watching this whole scene go on at the altar place, the Lord spoke to him that that lady was his wife. Her name was Polly. And so that day, Polly got saved and met her future husband. Wigglesworth came out of the balcony and at the close of the service found her, introduced himself to her, and began to take possession of her. If I can say that with all due respect to my women folk, he began to act like he was already married, which made her feel a little uncomfortable But in a short amount of time, they discovered that they were meant for each other, that God had blessed them, and they loved each other, and they got married. So now we have a great team. Mr. and Mrs. Wigglesworth worked together. Now, there was another problem. The problem was Smith Wigglesworth was a stutterer. He couldn't talk and speak clearly. That's why he would work with the children and do what he did in the children's ministry and work on the altar, because then he would not be on the platform with the challenge of him not able to speak a declarative sentence correctly without having a challenge. But his wife, Polly, was a rowdy and feisty preacher. And so if you know the Salvation Army in those days, that was the personality of everybody, really. And so she was the one that got on the stage and would preach and go down the streets and preach and do things. And she kept pushing Smith to preach. So he wanted to, but he had this speech impediment. And so they got into lots of arguments over this problem. He kept saying, "You preach and leave me alone," because he was embarrassed. And so like any married couple, I guess this is one of their challenges. So after a period of time of these arguments and their little fusses going on, finally they decided that she could preach and he would keep doing what he was doing, and there came peace on that issue. So let me recap this for a moment. Smith Wigglesworth could say this little boy. He's confirmed by the bishop. He feels the presence of God for the very first time in his life. And then he gets involved in the Salvation Army. I think he was about 16 years old when he got involved in. He saw his wife get saved. They get married, and they begin to work for the Lord in the Salvation Army. And he did not preach because he was a stutterer. But something great was about to happen. And we're going to talk about that when I come back.
What you've heard on today's show is only a small fraction of the incredible stories of another one of God's generals. For the complete story, pick up a copy of God's Generals Volume 1 today. Order a copy today or other life-changing books by visiting robertsliardon.com. That's robertsliardon.com. Or by calling 1-877-888-1500 for U.S. residents, or 1-941-748-3883 for viewers outside the U.S. Roberts Liardon accurately depicts without bias the good, bad, and the ugly, so you can learn from the lives of God's generals. Order your copy today.
The great event that was about to take place in Smith Wigglesworth's life was the baptism of the Holy Spirit. In 1904, 5, and